Hello, and welcome back. In today's video, we are going to be working on coils and spirals. So a coil is kind of like a slinky. It's often used as a decorative feature. So like, get a little closer, get a little focus. There we go. So like I've wrapped this together, but then I've continued my wire end and coiled all this. And I've done that simply because I thought it would look nice. Okay, so coiling here, I've coiled around this wire because I just wanted that texture of the coil. Okay, so that's just one way of using coils. But I want to show you how to make a coil. First you need a mandrel. Helps if the mandrel's in focus. You can really use anything for a mandrel though, any cylindrical shape. A mandrel is a word you're going to hear me use throughout this course. It's basically a word for any object you use to wrap your wire around. So your plier jaws can be a mandrel. You've probably heard of something called a ring mandrel before. This is the homemade one that I made. I've also got a bracelet mandrel. This is a stepped oval bracelet mandrel. Obviously I would use this to shape bracelets. So a mandrel can be anything that you're wrapping your wire or your jewelry around in order to shape it. So I am going to use this piece of 16 gauge wire as my mandrel. I have straightened it. So I cut a piece off and I straightened it. That's it. That's my mandrel. Dun, da, da, da. I am going to use this 22 gauge copper wire in order to make my coil. This is what my coil is actually going to be made with. So I need to, first of all, I'm going to work within a couple inches of the end of my mandrel. There's no point working back here and working around all of this wire every time you have to go around your mandrel, because once the coil is made, it'll slide up and down your mandrel. So let's just work here, and then we'll slide it over as we need more space. So the first thing I need to do is leave about a 1-inch tail. So I've got my wires crossing at 90 degrees, and I basically just get my thumb in here and I hold this. I do not bend this to the side. I want to hold it at that 90-degree angle. And from here, I'm just going to do some coils. This shouldn't be wholly unfamiliar after doing our closed loops. It's basically the same movement. We're just going to do a lot more of them. All right. If you're coiling along and you get a little bit of a gap in your coil, you can actually push your coil together. If your fingernails aren't that strong, and let's just make an intentional gap. Oops, there, I left a gap. Well, then you need to grab a set of grabbers. Any of your grabbers will do. And now this is kind of a funny thing if you don't get the explanation with it, but I'm grabbing with my grabbers so the jaws are touching my wire and sliding against my wire, but I'm not actually gripping with my hand. I'm not holding my wire. I'm just gripping very softly, very gently, so that my plier jaws are sliding along my mandrel. And when you get to here, they're going to catch on these coils, and you can actually press them into your other coils and get rid of any little gaps in your coils. So let's keep on going. If you're making a coil by hand, I highly recommend that you cut this piece of wire off of your spool, or you're going to get all kinds of twisting action happening. That isn't nearly as bad if the other end is left to spin and isn't attached to your coil. So another thing, if you kind of start going a little faster and you get a little carried away and maybe you accidentally coil on top of your coil. Oops, it happens to the best of us when we get a little bit of speed up. To fix this problem though, you actually have to uncoil your wire and recoil it in the correct position. Because we're working with dead soft copper, you do have the flexibility to undo a coil or two and then redo them. But you have to remember that because we've already made a sharp bend and then we've unbent that sharp bend, when we go to recoil it and rebend it, it's going to be more difficult to get it in the right position than it would have been to just put it in the right position in the first place. Now it's still totally doable, so it's still worth attempting to get the right position there. Whoops. There we go, get it next to there. And now I'm getting short on space here, so I'm actually just going to slide this down, giving me more space on my mandrel. And I'm going to hold on top of my coil. Now, I do recommend making your first coil or two by hand because it's just good practice. But when I'm just making a coil, I often do it with my drill. What I would do then is I would stick this mandrel into the chuck of my drill. And you kind of have to put a little kink in the ends because you can't often grab something this small in the center of your chuck. So because there's 3 grabbies, I often put it in between one of the grabbies and then just put a bend so that it does come out of the center of my chuck. From there, I would tuck the end of this into another part of the chuck, and your first couple of coils are going to be a little bit ugly till you get it under control. But then basically your drill is spinning this and you're just feeding the wire on by holding it like this. I don't have my drill here today, so I'll maybe have to make you a separate video showing you how to coil with the drill. It takes a lot more strength and to get it just right. And when you mess up and like start coiling over top, then you end up going quite far and you have to go back quite far. So messing up on the drill is not as good, but still totally doable. All right, I'm just gonna coil, making a nice coil. You do see I have the odd inconsistency, but it's pretty good. You're gonna probably find that you get more inconsistencies than this, and that's just because I've had a bit more practice. So I am pulling gently on my coil wire as I do this, keeping it tight. Like you don't want to just do this and make it really loose. You want to pull on it a little bit to keep it tight to your mandrel. Whoops, bumping the camera. Once you get going, and then you can start going a little faster. I'm sorry it doesn't want to focus on the coil because I've just got so much movement going on here. However long you want to make your coil is going to be up to you, depending on what you're using it for. I want to coil all of my wire here and get a nice long coil in order to show you how to coil a coil, which is a lot of fun. It's something that looks like you spent about 18 hours making, but you really didn't, which is why it's such a fun thing to make. All right. Just gonna work along until I get the rest of this made. Notice my coil wire is always at a 90-degree angle sticking off of my mandrel. That really helps to keep my coils tight. If I'm pulling like this and I start coiling, it's going to be really hard to get these tight coils. Okay, so always make sure you've got a nice 90-degree angle between your coil wire and your mandrel. I'm getting close to the end now. We're almost there. It's always nicer to make a coil when you have a wire end. If both sides of your mandrel are like tucked in somewhere, then you actually have to sew this wire underneath your mandrel for every single loop, and it takes a lot longer. But still totally doable if that's the look you want. It adds such a nice texture to your piece, especially after you antique it, that it's totally worth the time and trouble to do this. All right, a few more inches of wire. Let's see. Let's give me just a little bit more mandrel. And I've actually bent my mandrel. While you're doing this, I want you to aspire to not bending your mandrel, to keeping it straight. But, you know, even the best of us, because my tail is sticking out past my hand, if you don't hold your tail and you just spiral around, your tail just spins and you actually don't get any new coil. Like, I'm not doing anything. The coil is just spinning on the mandrel. So that's why this tail is super important. If you find that this tail gets bent along the same direction as your mandrel, it's not gonna do very much So make sure you keep it at that 90 degrees from your mandrel. And that's going to help everything just keep from spinning on your mandrel, so that as you're coiling, you're actually getting new coils instead of just spinning the whole thing on your mandrel. All right, down to my last couple of inches. Getting a little quicker here. Oops, there we go. As soon as I get quicker, I make a mistake. That's pretty normal. Okay, I'm down to my last little bit of tails. I'm just going to cut these off rather than like hurt my fingers trying to get the very last bit coiled. I'm just going to cut both of those ends off. I will go over them with a set of grabbers and just make sure that that cut end isn't sticking up where it's going to be sharp and pokey and scratchy, because scratchy is not our friend. All right, so you can keep this on your mandrel or your wire, or you can slide it right off. And then you get this like slinky type thing, which can be a lot of fun to play with. However, I want to show you how to take this to the next step. So you can leave it like this, you can use it like this. They're a lot of fun. I am going to re-straighten my mandrel because I did bend it a little bit. So get my grabbers and my nylon jaw pliers out. And just make it fairly straight. Again, I'm just getting the kinks out. I'm not actually worried that this is like bone straight. I'm almost ready to coil my coil. I've got a coil, I've got a re-straightened mandrel, and I actually need one more piece of my thinner wire. Oops, let's see, about how much do I need? Probably at least double the length of my coil. I've got quite a long coil. All right, so I've got a new piece of thin wire, and I am going to just start with a coil. So I still need my inch tail, and I'm going to start making another coil right near the end of my mandrel because that's where it's easiest to work. And I'm going to put at least 3 whole wraps on. You can do 5, you can do any number of wraps. I wouldn't do less than 3 though, because that's what you need to be secure. From here, I'm going to treat this coil like it's a bead, and I'm going to string it over top of my thinner gauge wire. There should be lots of room for this to kind of wiggle around on this thinner gauge wire. And I'm going to press it all the way down to here. Give myself a little more mandrel to work with. Okay, this is not an easy thing to do to start these coiled coils, okay? With this hand, I'm doing a couple things. I'm holding the mandrel, and I'm holding the tail, because if you don't hold the tail, you're not going to get anywhere. Okay, so I have to hold the mandrel and the tail. I also like to, if you have strong fingernails, get your fingernails kind of stuck in this last coil, okay? Now with this hand, I'm grabbing onto, not my coil, but I'm grabbing onto the wire past my coil here, and I'm using my 2 pinch fingers to actually push this coil down, because this next step, this coil wants to slide up, and we have to not let it. We have to keep it down as much as we can. Okay, so now I'm going to basically keep coiling here, but this very first one needs to be kind of a little bit loose. So it takes just a little bit of finesse to start it. But once you've got one started, you can put your finger right over top of this coil, and that's going to be what you're grabbing. And now I'm just going to keep going. As you do these, all these coils separate, making this cool pattern. Now notice this hand, I'm always moving up. I want it to be fairly close to where I'm coiling. Otherwise my mandrel is going to start to bend. So I'm always moving this holding hand close up to where I'm working. All right, when you get near the end, you have to kind of pull extra on this wire. Otherwise you're going to get this and get this kind of straight bit of coil that doesn't coil around. So you have to really pull hard to get this to come around your mandrel. And now to finish, I want just another 3 regular coils around my mandrel. It's a little crooked, but that's okay. So that's it. That's our coiled coil. I love this. I use it all the time in my work. From here, I would cut off my tails with my flush cutters. Make sure I don't have any scratchy bits. Remember, every time you cut a wire end off, just make sure that everything's smooth and you don't have any scratchy bits. This can be a lot of fun because you can take it right off your mandrel and use it like a bead, or you can keep it on your mandrel and we can put open loops in the end of our mandrel and make this into a link rather than a bead. Couple other quick things. Right where we started and I stuck my fingernail in between these two coils, oftentimes I end up with a bigger gap in here that I have to come in and actually squeeze. This one actually looks fairly uniform, so I'm not going to change that, but it's pretty common that I have a big gap in here and I have to just like squish those together. On this end where I finished, it's really common that I get 3 or 4 coils that haven't really separated like the rest. So if you've got a really strong fingernail, you can do this with your fingernail. Otherwise, you might need to get in here with like a butter knife. And I can actually separate these coils out so that they're spaced the same as the coils on the rest of it, and everything looks neat. I've also got the end of my coil coming up. Can you see that? As a hook. That's gonna suck. I'm gonna get in there with my flush cutters and cut that off so that I don't have a hook. Do I have a scratchy bit? It's a little bit scratchy. Let's see if I can tuck that in where it won't be so scratchy. I'm going to see if I can cut that off just a tiny bit shorter. Right here. There we go. I think that'll be okay. Alright, so that's our coiled coil. These are a lot of fun. They add a lot of depth and dimension. Often I'll even come back with another piece of wire. I'll start coiling again in the same direction. I'll coil right over top of this, and then I'll actually go over my coil kind of gently and let this sit in the cracks in between. And by doing this other step, it actually helps to protect the coil a little bit. This other wire is going to help protect it. This isn't long enough to actually do the whole thing. I'd get all the way across to the other side and coil it around here to anchor this end. So that's another way to change this coiled coil. But I just want to show you real quick how to make this into a link. This is a little bit of review. No, I can't get this wire off. There we go. Okay, a little bit of review here. Hopefully this is gonna be a review for you. I've got a flat cut in there, so I'm gonna grab my round nose pliers, bringing it flush to the end, let's say about there. Bringing my thumb in, making my P-loop to start. Till that butts in. Oh wait, I went way past. It's because I can't see what I'm doing. Butt in. Now, focus. Now, I need to grab on the bottom of my loop. It looks a bit mangled because I went far, and I'm going to center this loop over my post. Just sometimes you got to flatten everything out. Alright, so now I can actually slide this up to my loop, and I want to put a loop in the other side, but if we make the loop in the same way, starting at the end of the wire, then I have to know exactly where to cut this wire off. And maybe through experience you can take an educated guess, but another way to do this is to reverse engineer this. So to do that, I'm going to start, you know how we did this last bend where we centered the loop? I'm going to do that bend first. And I'm going to use some bullnose pliers and just make a bend. Dun, da, da, da. Super technical, I know. Now, I need to grab with my round nose pliers, kind of with one jaw tucked in that corner, but definitely on the far side of that bend. From here, this is going to go around my other jaw and down, Let's get the plier jaws out of the way and grab the top of that loop and go across. That's it. That shouldn't seem super unfamiliar because those are fairly similar to the steps in the closed loop. But now, instead of wrapping this tail around here, I actually want to cut it off right here, just short of where it crosses the wire. And I'm making sure to use the flush side of my flush cutters and getting in there right here. There it goes. Now, it's a little off to the side, but I can just straighten that out. And there's my other matching open loop. So I just turned this into a link, and we already know how to open and close these in order to attach this to stuff. So that's a coiled coil. These are a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed that. I do want to spend a little bit of time working on a spiral now. In fact, a couple of different spirals. Okay, I got another piece of my 16 gauge wire here. I am going to start with a nice flush cut on the end of my wire, of which I don't have, so let's cut a nice flush cut on the end of my wire. I want to make a tight spiral to start with, so I need to start with a P-loop, because I like my P-loops. I'm going to make it fairly close to the tip of my pliers so that it's fairly small, and I've already kind of kept going. So from here, I'm going to wrap, gently bringing this, so you got to be careful that this doesn't jump over the front or the back, but like stays around the outside of that P-loop. You can wrap it around half your P-loop, but that's about it. After that, when you've got your round nose pliers and they got to grab onto this one thing, this jaw over here is going to be in the way from you continuing around any farther. So you actually have to set your round nose pliers down at this point. This is all you can do with your round nose pliers when you go to make a spiral. From here, I'm going to use a set of my grabbers. Your bull nose ones, any of your grabbers actually. If you use your bent nose ones, I would recommend using the back edge of your bend here. I am going to grab on and I basically cover this entire loop. Okay, so you'll notice that I'm grabbing on way down here in the crotch, and I'm also grabbing on so that the first place it grabs onto is right here. So that means you don't want to flip this over this way, because then it's grabbing on down here instead of up here. So let's flip this back around. So I'm grabbing right down on the crotch of my jaws, and I'm grabbing, so this wire, this is where it needs to bend next, and I'm grabbing right next to there. I'm basically covering my spiral. I'm grabbing on so my spiral doesn't move in my plier jaws, and I'm bending this up about a quarter of a turn. Now I gotta let go with my plier jaws, bend this back, move this back down, and grab on again. And I'm gonna bend it about a quarter of a turn. And you kind of gotta keep this adjustment going. You're using your plier jaws to keep this whole spiral flat. That's what's keeping this wire from jumping over top or over or underneath. Okay, so I'm just gonna keep going, making my spiral until it is as big as I want it. Sometimes that's gonna depend on your design, how big you want it. But this is how you go about making a tight spiral. Now, I don't know if you can see, but I am making slight tool marks in the spiral just because I need a fairly firm grip in order to do this, especially in the middle when this is small. If you're really worried about these tool marks, you can use nylon jaw pliers, but when you first start doing this, you're going to find that it's really hard to grab on hard enough that this doesn't want to slip in underneath your nylon jaw pliers, because that's what nylon jaw pliers do, is they slip. But these won't leave any tool marks either, so it's a trade-off. Once your spiral is as big as you want it, ding, sorry, that was my lamp. I'm just going to cut a little tail off here, and I'm going to take my round nose pliers, and I'm going to just take this tail and spiral it back. So again, grab on so that's just flush with the edge of my jaws so I can just see it. And I'm going to bend this back until it butts right in. And that's just going to give me a little loop, turning this spiral into a charm. It gives you a place to hang your spiral from. So that's a really fun little spiral. However, I most commonly use a loose spiral where there's actually space in between these rather than a tight one like this. For today, when we just have a random piece of wire that we've cut off of our spool, it's a bit of an exercise to make a loose spiral with this, but I assure you that once we get into the next module and we start making our pendant, this loose spiral is actually my favorite way to finish off wire ends. Okay, so again, I need to start with a nice square edge. I believe this is not a nice square edge, so I'm just gonna snip it off so it is. I'm also going to start with the same P-loop. I really like these P-loops on the end of my wires for a couple of reasons. One is when you have a P-loop like this, your wire end is butt into your wire. So you don't actually have like a wire end that you can feel. It's not like this sharp end. It's actually kind of this roundy little loop, which is much nicer. It's also nicer to work with. When you've got a loop like this, you can stick your jaw in there, you can grab it here, you can grab it here, you can grab it here, you can grab it here. However you need to grab it in order to do what you're doing, you've got options when you've got a loop. When you've just got a wire end, this is the only way you can grab it. That's it. That's your options, and you have to work with it like this. So I really like this P-loop. Make sure that this is closed right up against your wire, otherwise you've got a hook and that's no good. So now we started this spiral with an open loop too, except this time we want to make a loose spiral. So what's the difference? Because they both start with that same P-loop. Well, when I make my tight loop and I'm grabbing on, my thumb is right here, okay, so that I can make this tightly curve around the loop that I've already got. When I want to make a loose wrap, a loose spiral, I actually move this hand way back, okay, so this is an odd angle for me, I'm gonna attempt to show you this, but I am going to just make kind of a spiral. And you want to start with kind of a loose spiral. Maybe I want to bend that in a little here. I make this look really easy because I've had a lot of practice doing it. It's not. You don't always want to even make it perfectly even. You just want it aesthetically pleasing. So you want to make it so it looks good to you. After you get kind of a general shape, then you can come in with your fingers and you can start tweaking it. Let's say I had like a straight bit here, and I could see that I want that straight bit to be a little more curved. So I'm just going to bring my finger in there and curve it around. Or you might have like a sharp bend that makes the whole thing look a little off. Well, I'm just going to unbend that sharp bend a little bit to make this nice, smooth curve. Now, you can bring your pliers in, and maybe you have a hardened spot and you need your pliers to make that curve just right. What I would strongly discourage, is if you want to curve, don't do this. Don't go here, and then here, and then here, and then here, and then here, because you're actually not going to get a nice curve. You're going to get all these tool marks, and you're actually getting a bend and a straight, and a bend and a straight, and a bend and a straight. And although you can do a little bit of tweaking like this afterwards, you're never going to get quite as nice of a curve doing that as you are just like making a sweeping thing to start with, and then tweaking it a little. I'm going to straighten that out a little. I'm going to bend this in a little. So play with this. It's kind of an exercise today, but when we get to the next module and we make our first pendant, and then I'm like, okay, let's finish our wires. Go make a loose spiral. I want it to not be the very first time you've done this. I want you to play with this a little bit. I make it look really easy. I make these spirals come out really nice, but that has taken a lot of practice. Don't expect them to turn out this nice your first time. There's a reason I'm getting you to practice this before we actually get to a finished piece of jewelry. So that's that. I hope you enjoy your spirals. We've got closed spirals, tight spirals, and we've got loose spirals. These are both a lot of fun and infinitely useful. I hope you find that fun. Have a great day. I just wanted to pop on real quick. I found my drill and I wanted to show you how to coil with a drill. This is just a piece of like about 16 gauge brass wire. I wouldn't go less than probably 18 gauge to coil around with the drill, or if you do, just make sure you're sticking in very small pieces, very short pieces. So now, in order to do this, I find that to mount it properly in the center of the chuck, my chuck just doesn't grab something this small. So I kind of mount it crooked. I'll turn it upside down so you can see what I mean by crooked. So that it's coming out of the center of my chuck, but I'm actually grabbing it between one of those three teeth. And then I just simply put a bend in it right there. So it's coming straight out the end of my drill so that when I spin it, at least right here, it's not going all over the place. So that's not too bad. Anyway, so that's my mandrel all mounted into my drill. This is just a 26 gauge copper wire I'm bringing in. You can use almost any gauge. I would recommend keeping it at least 6 gauges smaller, thinner than your mandrel. So it doesn't really matter which way you go, but I've basically got this just shoved into somewhere here in the chuck. And then I hold it against my mandrel. Sometimes getting started, you get a couple of ugly coils. Can I get it to focus here? Right there. There we go. But you kind of just... Oops, this is really crooked. There, that feels better. Take some practice to go that fast. Don't try and go that fast right away. Alright, I am having a hard time with my wire feed. There we go. Oops. There, shove that in before I go too far. Something I did want to mention, as your wire's coming off of your spool, I've got these really great super wide spools that I love. If you don't, and your spool ends up sitting on its side like this, as wire comes off of it, it kind of gets this twist in it when it's laying on its side. Okay, so if it's at all possible, even with a thinner spool, if you can mount the center on a stick or something, if I pull the wire off the spool while it's on edge like this, I'm sorry, I hope you can see that, you don't get any of the twisting coming off as it comes off of the spool. So it's going to be much, much better if you can keep the spool on its edge like this rather than have it lying on its side. If you have it lying on its side and you do a big long piece, as this comes off of the spool, you really do get this like twist that happens in your wire, and these can like tighten up and cause kinks, which are just going to cause you problems. So something to keep in mind. If at all possible, mount your spool on its end like this, and that's going to save you a lot of grief. So here's my coil. I'm just going to undo it, take the mandrel out. I do have a slight bend here, not a big deal. And once you take the tension off, when this is like still tight after just finished coiling this might not slide off because there's still tension and it's tight. But just back it off a little bit and it'll loosen it up, and you can take this right off of your mandrel. And now I've got this beautiful, almost perfect long coil. And I'll just cut the ends off. This is going to be perfect to go ahead and coil around again if I want to make a coiled coil. I hope that was helpful. I use the drill all the time to make this original coil. One thing I never do though is I never use the drill to make the coiled coil. When I want to coil this again and make my coiled coil, do that by hand. It's not going to save you any time doing it but with the drill. I hope you enjoyed that. Have a great day.